Well, Senator, thank you for that compelling and thoughtful vision of U.S. engagement and collaboration in the hemisphere. Now we have a few minutes for Q&A. People will be circulating with mics, so just please raise your hand if you have a question. Yes, Alejandro, the mic will be coming.
Thank you for your time and for letting us be here with you. You mentioned in your first part of your speech the relevance, and I couldn't agree with you more, of what corruption does with countries. I'm from Mexico, and it's definitely one of our biggest challenges. One of the things that's feeding corruption, as you very well know, is narcotráfico. I'm sure you know about supply and demand. So you didn't mention anything about the fact that in the U.S. is really where the drug is consumed. The guns that are killing Mexicans come from the U.S., and the money is also coming from the U.S. through the border. Do you have any reflection on that, and what can you do for it?
No, it's a very valid point. And I don't talk about it in the speech because I kind of limited it to and you're right, maybe we should re-examine that as part of our Western Hemisphere strategy. You know, the first has always been true. Sadly, America has been the market of choice for consumption for cocaine, obviously marijuana, cocaine, and now opiates and heroin, and that remains the case. And the other reality that we're now facing is that as many of these nations have become more prosperous, consumption has increased internally as well, so it's become a joint a problem in that regard. And to that, I would say a couple points. We now are facing this opiate crisis in the United States, and it is part of our, in fact, just today, as part of my appropriations role, is continue to seek full funding for programs, not just to prevent addiction to opiates, which often begin through the prescription medical route, but also to help treat people as a medical condition. The fact of the matter is, and the medical research on it is as clear as can possibly be, if you are addicted to an opiate, your ability to break free from it, absent military intervention, listen to me, absent medical intervention, yeah, airstrikes against opium, is almost none. And the problem is, for most people, those resources don't exist. So we've tried to work it from the ground up in Florida, because ultimately where these problems are manifesting themselves is at the local level. People become addicted, they wind up in the emergency room, they save your life with Narcan, and then you're back out on the street, and they're seeing some of the same people 6, 7 times a week, multiple times a day, who are overdosing now on street heroin. So addressing that, absolutely, we've got to cut off the demand part of it. And the supply part of it is important because of the things that it breeds. The problem is that as soon as you cut off one substance, it migrates to another. So this will be an ongoing challenge for us moving forward. But you're fair to point out that I neglected to mention that that is a big part of this endeavor, and that is the demand side. And I would venture to guess that in the years to come, sadly, in some ways, as nations become more prosperous, they will too see an uptick in consumption in the hemisphere, and so we may need to be working with them hand in hand on developing best practices in that regard as well. But you're absolutely right to point that out. Where's the microphone?
Microphone's there.
I don't.
I'll go ahead and ask a question.
Okay, good. Just so comprehensive, I know.
I guess my question is, what we're seeing in Venezuela is a humanitarian disaster. And you know, the unfolding of this is uncertain. But really, what is the sort of planning for a total sort of collapse in this humanitarian disaster that's going to take resources from the region?
Well, that's a great point. And first of all, I spent a lot of time, I don't mean this in a condescending way, a lot of time explaining to my colleagues the nature of the issue in Venezuela, because the traditional issue in many countries is you've got a government in power, you've got a civil society against them, and they're in this loggerheads. The issue in Venezuela is a little different. You actually have a National Assembly elected by the people of Colombia despite rampant fraud against them, who have basically been canceled. So the way I explain it to them is, imagine if the president tomorrow called down and said, I'm cutting off your funding, I don't care what laws you pass, we're not going to put them into place, we're not going to pay you any salaries, you don't even have money for ink, pens, paper, anything, and we're just going to ignore the National Assembly and any laws that you pass. That's the state of affairs. And then imagine if they said, and by the way, we're kicking out every independent news outlet, and the one that remained, I'm going to get my good friend to buy it so they can report my side of it. And then imagine if on top of that you invited a foreign power, in this case Cuba, to come in and take over your intelligence gathering, your passport operation and the like, because you don't in some ways, trust your own people to do it because you don't think they'll oppress their own people if push comes to shove. That's the situation we now face. So the demands of the opposition in Venezuela, we say the opposition, they're the majority in the National Assembly, is very simple. Under the Constitution put in place under Hugo Chavez, they're supposed to have elections this year. Hold the elections. Under the Constitution, if you gather a significant number of signatures, there has to be a presidential recall. They ignored it. Under the Constitution, it's supposed to be elections a year from now for the presidency. Hold that election. In essence, follow your own laws. That's their ask. And that's being ignored. And so I've been very pleased to see nations in the region take leadership on this. I really have. I mean, it's been one of the most uplifting experiences to see Mexico, Argentina, Chile, others, just stand, Peru, Colombia, stand firmly, and a growing number of nations joining that, and in Central America as well. You talk about the humanitarian crisis, that already exists. So last week I filed a bipartisan bill to create a fund and authorize a fund that would be available of assistance to help the transition in Venezuela, given the disaster they now face. And what that means is there's two reasons for it. One is to help the people in Venezuela, because it's going to be very difficult to be successful after an election or any sort of transition. And by the way, ideally, that's what I want it to be. The change in Venezuela, I want it to be at the ballot box. I don't prefer it be any other way. It may end up being another way, but that's the way I prefer it. It would be better for Venezuela if it was at the ballot box. But even if that were to occur, the societal challenges they face are extraordinary. And if those aren't confronted, that new government is going to fail, creating even further problems. And so the creation and the authorization of this fund so that it is available to provide assistance as soon as we're allowed to provide it. I think it also has the impact of helping our allies in the region. The last thing Colombia needs is a migratory crisis at its own border. It already faces significant challenges internally in the implementation of a peace plan and all the other challenges faced by some of these cartels that have emerged in areas where the FARC has decided to pull out. The last thing Brazil needs is a challenge. The last thing Guyana needs is a challenge of migratory pressure. And so that's also of assistance to them. So we have authored that bill. It's now in place, and we want to authorize the money so that then obviously we have to go out and make sure that it's in place and prepared to provide the aid if necessary. But I think this is an important moment for the region, and America's voice is important, and we should lead. And I've been pleasantly surprised that despite whatever people's political views, I know there are different views in this room about the current administration, I will say this to you. I was able to take Lilian Tintori to visit the president, who was the wife of Leopoldo Lopez, and I have received multiple reports from leaders in the region that when they meet with the president, he always asks about Venezuela. Now, I don't know if that meeting is what had that impact or something else did, but that's good news. The open-mindedness that exists in the administration beyond the White House, into the State Department and the National Security Council and the other divisions to do something with regards to this and give it the regional importance it deserves is promising. We have to follow through on it, and that's what I'm working on. But it's important. America's voice is important. But I think the most promising development I've seen is the nations in the region, the democracies in the region willing to stand up and condemn it. And I think that's had even a greater impact than in many cases some of the things that we have done. And I hope that that will continue. One of the best ways to create stronger ties with our allies in the region is to start doing things together, is to start engaging together in products and in projects of joint interest. And I think democracy in Venezuela should be one of them. And so in many ways, I think it's been a promising exercise in that regard as well. All right.